What do you love most about Chicago?
Well, I love a lot about Chicago. It is my favorite city in the world, and I have deep family ties to the city of Chicago. I would say probably my favorite thing about Chicago is the people.
You're listening to Notes from Chicago with Ashley Phillips. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Notes from Chicago. I'm so excited about this guest today because we're going to talk about something I didn't even know was a thing. We have Anne Morrissy. She is a nonfiction writer, and she is the author of Street Fight, the Chicago Taxi Wars of the 1920s. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So let's get into it about your book. So I mentioned before, this is I think a lot of times when people think about 1920s Chicago, they're thinking, they're thinking more maybe speakeasies and gangsters and that type of thing. This is really something that is, now certainly not talked about as much. So what were the 1920s taxi wars?
Yeah, so the taxi wars were kind of adjacent to some of the other things that we know about from the 1920s, some of the violence and some of the battles for dominance during the era of Prohibition. But it was sort of rooted in the fact that there was this new technology that had emerged at the time, and that technology was the automobile. So the first automobiles are on the streets of Chicago right around the turn of the century, and around 1900. And by 1915, a man named John Hertz, who we know better today as the founder of a very famous rental car company, he and his partner, Walden Shaw, they had come up with an idea to do sort of a livery service for people to be able to take a car service around. And then they expanded that livery service idea into what became Yellow Cab in Chicago. And Yellow Cab was a very kind of innovative new business, and it scaled up extremely quickly from just about 50 cars to thousands and thousands of cars on the street very quickly. But Yellow Cab had this, amazing business model that was scaled up really quickly, but it also inspired a lot of competitors and a lot of kind of cutthroat competition between other companies that wanted to get the business that Yellow Cab was getting. And there were almost no regulations on this at this time. So it was this era of time in Chicago in the 1920s when you could be riding in the back of your cab, and another cab would come up alongside your cab, and that driver might start shooting at your driver while you're in the back of the cab. And they're fighting over all kinds of things. They're fighting over turf warfare, they're fighting over union membership, they're fighting over alliances within their own groups. They're fighting over, all kinds of sort of what we might call inside baseball things now. But these issues were very much a part of that industry because it was a new industry and because it was an extremely lucrative industry.
Just curious if having the possibility of someone shoot at you while you are riding in a cab affected ridership at all at that time.
You would think that, right? Like, I think that's how our minds think today. At the time, it was such a convenience and such a new convenience to be able to get around the city quickly and easily and directly how you wanted to go without having to wait for the horse cars or having to wait for, other forms of slow public transportation, that people were willing to sort of take the risk, I guess, right? I mean, I think of it sort of adjacent to how, like, we do some things in our modern lives. We do some things with internet technology that, we maybe know are perhaps not like the best things to be doing from a privacy perspective or from a safety perspective in other ways, but we're willing to risk it for the convenience of whatever that is, right? And I think they had a kind of similar attitude in the 1920s. You also have to remember that in the 1920s in Chicago, just stepping out onto the street was dangerous for various reasons, right? It was a very there was a lot of different reasons for violence happening on the streets of Chicago during the Prohibition era. So I think that because of all of that, they had a higher tolerance maybe for for their safety being a little bit compromised.
What inspired you to kind of focus on this part of Chicago's history?
So, yeah, that's actually an interesting story. My great grandfather was a man named Charlie Gray, is how I refer to him. His name was actually Charles Wellington Gray. He was a person who started out as a cab driver, actually, on the streets of Chicago in the very earliest days of the cab industry. And he kind of rose through the ranks, partly because he was good friends with John Hertz, who I mentioned before had co-founded the Yellow Cab Company. So through his friendship with John Hertz, he kind of rises very quickly from being a cab driver to being John Hertz's right-hand man for quite a while. And then eventually John Hertz decides to sort of step away from the day-to-day management because he wants to focus on some other business opportunities, including Hertz Rent-A-Car and some other very forward-thinking transportation things that John Hertz was involved in. And he sort of grooms my grandfather to be his replacement as the president of Yellow Cab. So in 1925, my great grandfather takes over as president of the Yellow Cab Company in Chicago. He's president for about 2 years, and then he dies under kind of mysterious circumstances at the height of the taxi wars. And this had always been kind of passed down in my family as a rumor that perhaps his death was not, in fact, an accident, but it was, in fact, an incident related to these taxi wars. So I'd heard about them all my life. I didn't know much about them. I would ask people I'd talk to Chicago historians and say, do you know anything about these taxi wars? And a lot of people had never heard of them or knew very, very little about them. And so I decided, you know what, I'd kind of like to dig into this and see what I can find out through some research. And that's really what got me into the story in the first place.
That's so interesting. And I love that it was, I hate the circumstances, but love that it was, a story kind of passed down or talked about throughout your family. What were the mysterious circumstances? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, well, so it was he woke up on Christmas Day, 1927, and at the time he had 6 children under the age of 13 in the house. So he gets up, he opens some Christmas presents with his family, and then he was an avid horseman. He liked to ride, and so he kept a horse at a stable at his club, which today it is the South Shore Cultural Center, but at the time it was the South Shore Country Club. And he kept a horse there that he would go, and then sometimes he would ride in the mornings. So it's Christmas morning, which is an odd time of year to be out for a ride, right? It's cold, it's winter. It's also a day where you probably would spend it with your family normally. But instead he goes out after they open their gifts. He goes out riding with his brother-in-law and another person who is in the management of Yellow Cab Company. And they go out riding in Jackson Park, and from there the statements sort of conflict, but the people who were with him always said they never saw this happen, but they came around the bend and he was on the ground next to his horse and he had a single skull fracture. So he was raced to the hospital, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital, unfortunately. And nobody ever really knew what happened, right? And so it was, very quickly there was a coroner's jury was brought together to investigate. Very quickly, within 24 hours, they determined, oh, it was an accident. Moving on. Very little investigation was done, and that was, sort of just cut and dried. Oh, it was an accident. But if you look at his death in the timeline of all of the things that were happening in the taxi wars at the time, I hope that the book makes a compelling case that there may have been another story there that just was never really uncovered.
That's wild. That's super interesting. I'm curious how the city or like lawmakers or law enforcement was reacting to kind of, or not reacting to what was happening on the streets of Chicago in regards to this specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually an interesting story because Chicago was kind of the proving ground for a scaled up cab company of the size of Yellow Cab. It was really the first city where that happened. And so John Hertz becomes very sort of leadership focused as a result, and he has quite a few connections with city government at the time. So he goes in and he's sort of working with the city council and advocating for some rules and regulations to be placed on the industry. Yellow Cab was what I learned from researching this is that Yellow Cab was very they were really trying to be a leader in the field, let's put it that way. And they were trying to do a lot of things that were pretty forward thinking at the time. So they introduced profit sharing with their employees. They had a lot of perks for their employees that were kind of unheard of at the time. They provided doctors and dentists and tailors, and they had lunch kitchens throughout the city where their employees could go and eat at discounts. And so they were really very forward thinking, and that kind of extended to they were trying to communicate to the public that they were doing everything they could to make this the safest experience for the public. And so part of that was they were lobbying the city council to sort of put some guidelines and some rules and regulations in around this. So the city council is passing a few laws at the time that, and would go on to pass even more, a little bit later, that are actually still on the books today that we kind of take for granted. When you see a cab in the city of Chicago, it will always have the owner of the cab on the side of the cab, and that's one of the regulations that John Hertz sort of advocated for and that the city council passed in the 1920s. So the city council is trying to do some things to make the cab industry put these consumer protections in for the cab industry, and then on the other side you've got law enforcement that's kind of trying to take care of some of the violence, but it's a very corrupt era in the Chicago law enforcement world. So some policemen are really doing a lot of work to try and curb this violence, and some of the policemen are a little bit complicit in it. It sounded like in this era.
Mentioning, having the name of the cab or the owner of the cab or the cab company on the side of the vehicle is interesting. Was there a sense for, like, riders of, oh, I choose yellow cab versus these other cabs, this sort of brand awareness? I'm curious if there was that and people were making choices like that.
From what I understand, there were people who were very brand loyal particularly to Yellow Cab in this era, because Yellow Cab, for the first 15 years of its existence, when John Hertz and Walden Shaw and my great grandfather were in charge of it, they really were trying to do something to sort of to foster trust in the public, in the taxi riding public. And I think that did bear fruit. And so there were people who were pretty brand loyal to Yellow Cab during this time. One of the things I was able to dig up during my research was a scrapbook of all of the Yellow Cab employee newsletters from the early 1920s, and they would print their own. They called it the Taxigram. It was a newspaper, and they would distribute it to all their employees, and it had all kinds of interesting info in it about tips about what to do when you're driving and this happens, or avoid this area because of construction, or whatever. But then it also had they would reprint letters that they received from the public that were sort of praising the service, and they got hundreds of letters from riders calling out specific taxi drivers, doing, just saying that they really appreciated, this service or that service, or, and people, it seems like people were very brand loyal in that era.
Amazing. Okay, so I am curious now that you're talking about. Oh, we looked at employee. I looked at employee newsletters. When you are, this is maybe a more general question about your process, but when you're setting out to start researching, how do you do that? And maybe we can even use that newsletter as an example, because my thought was like, whoa, how did you find those? And I mean, it's interesting to even think about something, from 100 years ago that probably at the time seemed pretty, mundane, being preserved now in this digital age.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's actually a good story as to how I found those because so research was a challenge with this particular topic because there were no books on this topic already written. Nobody had ever really dug into this topic in any depth before. So I was having to do all of the research from primary sources. I did rely very heavily on online digitized newspapers, and I would go through and do very extensive searching of key terms and key names that I knew were associated with the industry during this era. And I had a research assistant help me, and we compiled over 1,000 clippings from online newspapers was part of the process. But then I kind of got stalled out after that, and I was a little frustrated. And I was actually talking to my aunt on the phone, my mom's sister, and she said, "Oh, how's the research going?" This was, maybe halfway through the process. And I said, "Well, it's going okay, but I'm a little frustrated because it's really hard to find primary resources from the 1920s. It's been a long time. A lot of them have not survived, a lot have been destroyed." And she said, "Oh, well, I've got this scrapbook in my house that is all of the Yellow Cab employee newsletters from 1919 to 1922. Would you like me to send those to you?" And I thought, yep, I sure would. Yeah. I mean, I'd been working on the book for like a year and a half at this point,
Oh
right? And I had
boy.
no idea these even existed. And then they just sort of appeared out of nowhere. And so she dropped them, she shipped them off from Seattle, and they came to Chicago. They were returned to their original city, and they were an absolute wealth of information to learn about the industry at this time and to learn a little bit of history of the company. And I mean, that was a real treasure to be able to do that. So sometimes you get lucky. You
Yeah.
put your feelers out there and you interview a lot of people, and somebody says, "Oh, I know about this thing, and you should go look at that." Or, you sort of just it's a little bit like being a bloodhound and just following the
Yeah.
scent wherever you can go.
Did you go back? That happened to me, I would go back and grill my family members and say, "Hey, you have something in the attic, in the basement somewhere, with
Yeah, yeah.
information."
So it was a little frustrating in that the great grandfather is my mom's father's father, and unfortunately, my mom's father was kind of estranged from the family starting in the 1960s. So, unfortunately, that side of the family, which might have been a huge wealth of information, we had essentially kind of lost touch with a lot of them. But somehow, my aunt, who was still in touch with some of them, this scrapbook had filtered to her somehow over the years and was just sitting there. So that was a gift, obviously. And what's been interesting is since the book came out and has been out and I've been promoting it, I actually have heard from like sort of extended family members on that side of the family. Second and third cousins have reached out to me because they read the book and they found it fascinating. And so in after the book came out, I did get a little bit more from family members that had things squirreled away, but nothing on the level of this scrapbook that I got from my aunt. So that was just a gift from above, I think, honestly.
That's so cool. For the new stuff that you're hearing, is it enough to like make write an updated version or
What is gratifying to know is that as I get new things in, everything that I wrote is absolutely 100% accurate. What I have learned since is just a little like fleshed out a little bit more detail, honestly. So I don't know that there's enough to really do a sequel or an updated edition. But it's just gratifying to know that for all the work that I did on the research, I got it pretty close to spot on, I think. So. Yeah.
did you when you set out to write the book or start researching the book, did you have a sense of how that the research would be as, challenging as it was?
I sort of sensed that it might be hard to disentangle all of the many storylines. I mean, I had a sense that there were a lot of incidents that happened during this time. And as I started to research, that turned out to be correct. And there turned out to be even more incidents than I could ever have imagined. And so I knew it was a big project that I was taking on. I sort of started doing the process of putting together the book proposal and the sample chapter and all of that while I was sheltering in place during COVID. So I had a lot of free time at the time, right? And so the first process of writing that first chapter and doing the initial research, I did have a lot of free time. Then, by the time I got the book contract and did the rest of the writing and the research, the world had opened up again. I had taken on a new job as an editor of a magazine, and so that did become a real project to manage my time and figure out how to do this project in a way that gave it the time that it needed and the attention that it needed, but then also sort of balance that with living your life. So I think to your question, I don't know that I knew exactly what I was getting myself into, but and it certainly turned out to be more challenging than I ever imagined. But I also do think that I had a little sense that it was going to be a big project.
You mentioned that you just said there were more incidents than you could have possibly imagined. Um, what were the ones you found most surprising or most striking, that were just real standouts or maybe shocking for you as you were writing this book or putting together this book?
There were several, honestly, but one that really stands out in my mind there. So, Yellow Cab starts in 1915, and then its major rival ends up being Checker Taxi. Checker Taxi is founded a few years later, and initially there are just some sort of skirmishes on the streets between Checker Taxi and Yellow Cab, and they kind of escalate and escalate and escalate. But then, starting in around, I believe it's about 1925, there is also a whole sort of civil war going on within Checker Taxi, where there are two different factions trying to gain control of the leadership of Checker Taxi. And one of the factions that's trying to take control, on its surface, it is the Teamsters Union leadership. But behind the Teamsters Union leadership, there are several sort of gangster adjacent people that have sort of taken over the union leadership in order to try and take over this lucrative taxi business, right? And during this era, that is some of the worst violence of the taxi wars. So there is an incident that happens shortly after the union leadership is sort of in power for a minute at Checker Taxi, and then they get ousted briefly. And right after that period happens, there is an incident that happens in broad daylight on the west side of the city at the Checker Taxi offices, and the sort of gang affiliated union leadership shows up and just open fires on the entire office of Checker Taxi, which is now full of the new leadership from the other side. And it's just essentially like, like a shooting. They show up with machine guns, they knock down the doors, and they kill two guards that were stationed outside, and they shoot a couple other people, and it's intended as a warning, essentially, to the new leadership that they will be back, and that this is not the end of the story. But that was quite shocking to read that was happening, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday on the west side of the city during this time, and people had completely forgotten about it.
And there were no repercussions, I'm assuming, for.
A lot of times when I would try to figure out kind of, was anybody ever held responsible for any of these incidents that I would uncover along the way? 9 times out of 10, maybe more than that, no, nobody was ever, people might have gone to trial and then, like that didn't end up, they were acquitted, or, the jury couldn't decide, or whatever it might be, that like nobody was ever really held accountable for a lot of the things that happened during this era. And there are incidents later on where these sort of gang affiliated people are also doing things to intimidate the judges and the juries. And there's actually the bombing of a juror's house later on in the whole thing. And so, I mean, even when they tried to hold people accountable, that would then put you and your family in jeopardy as well. So I kind of understand, I guess, but no, a lot of times they just got away with it.
Sounds like a Martin Scorsese movie.
That's what
Wow.
everybody says. Yes, they're like, when is the movie coming out?
Yes, yes.
Like,
This should be a movie. It sounds it is exciting and wild and just really fascinating.
yeah.
So this we obviously don't have shootouts between cabs today. So uh, how did this kind of calm down? Like, what was the, resolution, or when did this, when does this era sort of end?
Yes. Well, so I don't want to give away too much about the ending of the book because I do
Okay.
feel like it sort of builds to a crescendo, and that is sort of the what sort of hastens the end of the war. But I
Yeah.
will say that eventually, partly what brings it to an end is the fact that the depression hits in the end of 1929, and that sort of changes the landscape for the taxi industry in such a way that the warring cab companies end up sort of consolidating under one owner. Let's put it that way. And so that is kind of like the battles that you're seeing in the 1920s are two big companies and then some other smaller companies all kind of battling to see who's gonna win this business war essentially. And by the early 1930s, partly because of the Depression, one person has consolidated power in this industry, not just in Chicago, but then also in several other cities as well. And so that's why you'll see, even in New York and in Philadelphia and in many other cities, we still to this day associate a yellow cab with a checker border around the edge of it as sort of the classic taxi. And that is a result of how things ended up resolving in Chicago in the 1920s. And then it sort of went from there, went to all these other cities. So, it does eventually resolve itself. Unfortunately, there is a lot of violence that happens in service of that consolidation, and that's kind of what the book hopefully makes clear is that this era of violence was sort of building towards something and crescendoing towards something, and did end up having long lasting effects.
So it's really interesting having this conversation. I remember, I feel like it was maybe 10 years ago when I started hearing friends talk about, or maybe more than 10 years ago. Oh my goodness, about, they lived in San Francisco and they're like, oh yeah, you can order this black car service from your phone, which was Uber, and, kind of ended up being the forerunner to what we, know as Uber today. And that completely changed the landscape and the business for cabs, for cab companies. So I'd love to hear kind of the connection, if there is a connection, between where we are now and where we were then.
There's definitely a connection because, the rideshare companies come along, and yeah, a little over 10 years ago, and they go into cities that have pretty strong regulations surrounding livery and ride services.
Yeah.
And these new sort of models of rideshare companies come in and they say, well, we don't think that any of those rules should apply to us because we are a different kind of company, right? Which is arguable. Like, were they really a different kind of company, or were they just using a different kind of technology for you? Like if you look at Yellow Cab, they invented a new kind of technology back then for hailing a cab, which was they had a huge dispatch center with hundreds of telephone operators on the south side, in the South Loop, and that's how you would hail your cab back then. So what the rideshare companies were doing was essentially changing the way that you got a ride, but they weren't really doing anything fundamentally different. There was still a person in a car driving you from point A to point B, but they claimed that those rules and regulations that had applied to cabs shouldn't apply to them, and they just sort of refused to follow them, famously, and cities eventually just sort of shrugged and said, oh well. And I think part of the reason that people didn't fight that harder is because we had forgotten that those rules and regulations came out of this period of extreme violence in the 1920s, in Chicago specifically. And those rules and regulations were created as consumer protections to try and protect the cab riding public. And people had just forgotten about all of that, and they didn't understand why those rules and regulations were on the book still. They didn't sort of think of, what could go wrong, right? Like, why do we need to have, regulated rates? Well, we need to have regulated rates because before that, people were charging, huge discrepancies in what people were paying to ride in these cabs, and that was considered unfair, right?
Yeah.
So all of these things now, all of these rules that we sort of were very cavalier about just being like, oh, you don't need to follow those. I think now 10 plus years later, we're sort of realizing, oh, maybe that was a good thing, and maybe that came out of something meaningful, and maybe we should have evaluated that a little bit harder before we were so cavalier about saying, oh, that's all right, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too because now I had an experience recently in New York where I called an Uber and a cab came to pick me up.
Yep.
And then it was raining outside and I was charged a surcharge for this ride. And it was super frustrating. I mean, the surcharges are always frustrating, but it was super frustrating because, like, if I had been able to hail a cab, which is also very difficult to do now on the street, as opposed to like, excuse me, if you're at an airport where you can easily stand in the cab line, it would have been much cheaper than what I was charged because of those regulations that you're talking about.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so what's next for you? Are you working on a new book? Do you have something or that you want to talk about that new?
I writing this book was a labor of love, and it was a huge project, and I felt very called to tell this story. So I was willing to sort of burn the midnight oil and burn the
Yeah.
candle at both ends and do all the things I needed to do to get this book written and out into the world. I have not yet found the next topic that is going to be my passion to that level that I'm willing to kind of make those life sacrifices. But I'm hopeful that something will come along eventually. But right now, I'm just sort of enjoying promoting this story, which was a very very passionate project of mine.
Love it. So we're going to go back to another Chicago, like very Chicago specific question.
Yeah.
I love to ask people this, both because am interested to hear people's answers. Also, selfishly, I hope I will hear about something I don't know about and be able to plug into. But when people come visit, or when people are coming to Chicago, and they ask you, "Oh, what should I do in Chicago?" What do you tell them to do?
That is a great question. So I would say my answers sort of fall into a couple of different buckets. Um, I was on top of my mind recently was the fact that one of my favorite things that Chicago does is a thing called Open House Chicago, which actually just happened recently. And that is a weekend in October when the Chicago Architecture Foundation arranges to have tours of many, many, many buildings in the city that some of which are, always open to the public, but they have special tours for Open House Chicago. And some of them are not open to the city usually, but you get to go tour them as part of Open House Chicago. And that is one of my favorite events in the city of Chicago. Every year, I almost never miss it. And it's because of Open House Chicago that I was able to do some research for my book, and also some personal research as well. So I actually got to go stand in the room in the South Shore Cultural Center where my grandparents had their wedding reception in 1946, for example. So it's just this amazing thing that Chicago does to try and share its history of buildings and architecture and the stories of Chicago, and I absolutely love that weekend. So I always tell people if you're planning a trip to Chicago, try to come for Open House Chicago weekend because it's amazing. Another location I really love that is open to the public year round is the Harold Washington Library. which was also extremely helpful in helping me research my book. The fifth floor librarians were amazing. They have all the microfilm of the old newspapers there, and they were wonderful. But I was also, for many years, I was on the associate board of the Chicago Public Library Foundation. And so we would do an annual fundraiser every year in the Winter Garden, which is the beautiful event space on the top floor of Harold Washington Library. And, it's a very special place, and I recommend people check it out. Another place I highly recommend in Chicago is the Old Town School of Folk Music up in Lincoln Square. I absolutely love that whole space, and I love the people, and I love everything about it. But they have an amazing concert schedule, and they have a very small, intimate theater there, and you can go hear some incredible musicians in a very small space. And then you can also sign up to take lessons on a variety of instruments and dance and voice and all kinds of very cool things there as well. So don't miss the Old Town School of Folk Music. And then my last two selections are more sort of seasonal events, but summer street festivals in Chicago are some of my favorite things to do, right? From the Old Town Art Fair to the neighborhood festivals with live music. I mean, it's such a great energy. And again, it brings all of these really cool, creative, unique people together. They're selling the things they make. They're sharing their food with you. You're hearing their music. It's just an amazing environment to put yourself into in Chicago. And then my last choice, my last of five, is Christmas in Chicago in general is my favorite season of the year. So, I mean, there's a million things you can do in Chicago at Christmas time, but some of my favorites are the White Christmas sing-along at the Music Box Theater up on Southport. The movie White Christmas, they show the film, and everybody comes and sings along with it, and it's this wonderful communal experience. I also love zoo lights. I like to go see the tree at the Walnut Room in Marshall Fields. I mean, there's just all these magical Chicago moments that I feel like if you are able to come to Chicago at Christmas time, you absolutely should do that.
Love it. Those are so good. And I had never heard about White Christmas at the Music Box. So
Yeah,
that's a good one to put away. I love the sing-alongs at the Music Box. That's so fun.
so fun.
Do you, just out of curiosity, since you mentioned Old Town, do you play an instrument?
I do, yeah. I play guitar, and I have since I was in high school and college. So I have taken some guitar lessons there, and I really enjoyed that. And then I also inherited through the family an antique mandolin, and so I briefly took mandolin lessons there just to sort of say, okay, somebody in the family needs to know how to at least play a few chords on this antique mandolin that we own. So I did about a year of mandolin lessons there and had a wonderful time with that as well. So, but it's a really positive really welcoming, positive place to learn a new instrument. Even if you've never taken one before, I do highly recommend it.
Amazing. I love that. Okay, Anne, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We will all be eagerly awaiting the movie version of this book. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been great chatting.
Thank you for listening to Notes from Chicago. This podcast is edited and produced by Tanisha Blakely. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Notes from Chicago on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts.